So when it comes to Putin's war in Ukraine, you can count on one thing, that references to the Russian economy will be made, whether that be that it's on the verge of collapse or that it has remarkable resilience. The relevance of the Russian economy is crucial, and no more than in 26. Because you see, Russia is now spending more than 7% of its entire economy on the military, and yet growth slows to a mere 0.6%. Its interest payments on debt now exceed its spending on education and healthcare combined, while oil and gas revenues, once 40% of the federal budget, have fallen to just a quarter. Yet despite all that, Russia's economy hasn't collapsed. In fact, it's become the world's 9th largest economy, overtaking Canada and Brazil, depending upon how you measure it. But that raises, therefore, a far more uncomfortable question. What if Russia's economy isn't collapsing? What if something far more dangerous is happening instead? Because Russia's economy isn't, well, it's not really recovering either. Instead, it has entered something far more dangerous, a state where it can survive and endure, but quietly destroy its own future. Mountaineers have a name for this condition. They call it the death zone, the altitude above 8,000 meters, where the human body can no longer repair itself. Yes, it can still function, but it slowly consumes itself, cannibalizes itself to survive. And today, well, that's exactly what is happening to Russia's economy. So in this video, I wanted to explain why Russia's economy is entering this death zone, why it marks a decisive turning point, and what it means going forward, as even the Kremlin is implicitly accepting a future defined not by growth, but by stagnation and mere survival.
This is the Global Gambit.
How you going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, where if you're new here, we look at the nexus of geopolitics, economics, and international relations. This channel exists to go beyond the headlines, not to merely explain, but to also critically analyze what is happening, why it's happening, and what it means for the future of global power, strategy, and for all of us in between. Now, of course, nowhere is the most important story than the war in Ukraine, the peace talks that we're seeing in Geneva, and of what's happening inside Russia's economy. All of that coming up, but as always, I pose a question for you. What do you think of Russia's economy in its current state? Is 2026 the make or break year, or is it going to continue into 27? This is a broader, forward-looking sort of video, taking into consideration what we could expect to see in the next few months. But with that, let's get into it. Now, when Western leaders imposed sanctions in 22, there was, of course, a widespread confidence that Russia's economy would not be able to sustain itself. It would just collapse. In March of that year, President Biden at the time declared that Russia's economy was on track to be cut in half and would soon fall out of the world's top 20 economies. But as I said in the beginning, that prediction didn't come true, and it's actually entered the top 10. Indeed, Russia has adapted, rather remarkably so. Military spending has surged. Factories in many different industries have reopened. Unemployment has fallen to just 2%, although if you know your economics, you'll know that full employment is not necessarily a good thing, but more on that later. Now, on paper, of course, this all looks like resilience, like impressive manipulation, but it wasn't. It's more substitution in the eyes of not just analysts in the military, but economists as well. Civilian economic activity has been replaced by military production. So this is not really economic recovery. It's more about economic mobilization. Russia wasn't really rebuilding its economy in the past few years. It was restructuring it for permanent confrontation, or what we otherwise know as a wartime footing. And by now, as we enter early spring of 26, the consequence of that decision is becoming more visible than ever. Growth is largely down not to 1 or 2%, but to zero. Oil revenues are absolutely falling. Taxes are absolutely rising. And investment is absolutely weakened. This is quintessential stagnation. And more importantly, it is stagnation that the Kremlin increasingly appears willing to accept. Because, well, reversing it would require dismantling the very system that now sustains the state. Nobody knows that better than Vladimir Putin. Russia's economy has entered this negative equilibrium. Stable, sure, in the short term, but it is structurally weakening over time. Now, in the eyes of some, Russia today has no longer actually one economy. It has two. You see, the first economy is the military economy. This includes weapons manufacturing, defense contractors, ammunition production, and industries directly supporting military logistics. This sector is and has grown rapidly. It is receiving priority access in every shape or form for labor, access to capital, access to imports, and of course, overwhelming state support. It is expanding at ridiculous rates. It is hiring at ridiculous rates. It's investing and surviving. But compare that to the second economy, the civilian economy. That is shrinking. Private businesses, consumer industries, technology startups, small and medium enterprises or SMEs. These are sectors that are being slowly starved of resources, effectively starved to death. Over the past 3 years, Russia's overall manufacturing output has increased by 18%. Now, at first glance, that may well sound impressive, but there is a hard reality to that. The entire increase and more came from, of course, defense-related production. Strip out military production, and Russia's civilian industrial base has actually been contracted. So that doesn't equate to economic growth. It equates to that economic cannibalization. The state is diverting resources away in such an extent from production, sustainable interests, and into industries designed purely for destruction. Ones that have no shelf life, that have no trickle-down effect, which, whether you believe in or not, in principle does not yield greater benefits for the economy in the long term. Because if you're producing shells, tanks, munitions, and such, that doesn't come back in a positive feedback loop. So this brings us to the most dangerous feature of Russia's new economic system, what we might call the military rent. You see, during the 2000s, Russia's economy grew because of its oil exports. Foreign buyers paid Russia handsomely for energy. That money flowed into the economy consistently and fluidly. It funded infrastructure, consumption, investment, and it therefore created real, tangible wealth. But today's military spending is fundamentally different. It's not generating any external income. It is internal redistribution. What that means is that the government takes money and transfers it into military production. Factories, they produce tanks, they produce missiles, ammunition, and so on. And that, by extension, produces wages, which creates labor activity, productivity. But that does not create future economic capacity. It does not produce exports that generate sustainable income. They do not increase productivity long term. They do not make Russia and therefore Russians richer. They simply allow the system to tick over, to sustain itself. It is, in effect, the economic equivalent of burning your own furniture to stay warm. Sure, you survive the winter, but you destroy your own house, which, well, come round the next winter, you're kind of screwed over. And then you have to consider the fiscal component, because the strain is already beginning to show there as well. Russia's budget deficit reached approximately 5.6 trillion rubles, around $73 billion. Now, interest payments on government debt exceed spending on education and healthcare combined, as I laid out at the beginning. But there's a deeper problem that lies in the energy revenues, because for decades, oil and gas formed the backbone, unsurprisingly, of Russia's entire economic model. As recently as 2022, fossil fuel taxes made up roughly 40% of Russia's entire federal budget. And now that share falls dramatically to around 25%. Oil prices have dropped significantly, with Russian Urals crude falling from around $90 a barrel pre-war to closer to, well, 50 in some regards, and some people who've told me it's as low as half that, $25 a barrel. Then, of course, the sanctions play the role there as well. Russia has been able to partially offset lost European markets by selling more oil to China and India. But these markets, while replacing European markets, are not the same and are much less profitable. They've also demanded steep discounts because they know they can, despite supposedly being some of Russia's best friends. And so in some cases, purchases are now slowing as well. Threats of secondary sanctions by the Trump administration have seen and heightened that, as we saw at the end of last year. So overall, Russia's fossil fuel export earnings remain significantly below any pre-war levels. So it matters because energy exports remain the financial oxygen of the Russian state. And therefore, without strong export revenues, sustaining military spending becomes not just difficult, but frankly impossible. To compensate, therefore, the Kremlin has to turn elsewhere, inevitably to raising taxes. Corporation tax has increased. VAT has risen to 22%. That's higher than almost any other Western economy. And income in taxes are also increasing. Simultaneously, the state is crowding out spending on education, healthcare, civilian infrastructure, whatever you can think of, name it. The economy is being structurally reorientated entirely around the war. So therefore, it creates an uncomfortable paradox. The very spending that keeps the economy stable today is completely dismantling its ability to grow tomorrow. And so beyond a paradox, it creates a trap. Russia's economy now depends on military spending to remain stable. The system is becoming dependent on the very thing that it is weakening. Now, economic pressure does not necessarily force Russia to stop, because Vladimir Putin is not only looking at Russia's economic condition, he's looking at everybody else's. Europe's economies are not doing perfectly either. They are very stagnant. The political divisions that undermine much of the European Union in a broader sense do exist and in some ways continue to grow. Ukraine equally is exhausted, and Western support fluctuates with political cycles. It's one of the things that an autocracy can bank on compared to a democracy. Different political cycles, which impact economic continuation and longevity. Overall, global debts are rising as well, trade tensions continually increasing. And therefore, from the Kremlin's perspective, this, as it usually and largely always has been, is a cost of endurance. If everyone is weakening, the winner may simply be the one who weakens slower, who can hold out the most, in a way that the Europeans may need to hold out for a better tomorrow with a different administration other than Trump. So this fundamentally changes the strategic calculus. How systems become trapped. Economic pain does not necessarily lead to this compromise. It can lead to reinforced persistence, because the alternative may appear even more dangerous. Even if the conflict ended tomorrow, Russia will face enormous structural obstacles. Its long-term population problem. Since 2019, Russia's population has fallen by roughly 2 million people. Not merely because of low birth rates, but because of significant emigration by the war and Putin's mobilization of late 2022, for example. Therefore, though, it creates severe labour shortages, which therefore also explains Russia's extremely low unemployment rate. Not because the economy is booming, but because there are just fewer workers. When you reach the idea of full employment, it's not sustainable and often shows a country that is nearing absolute bust levels. Overheating, other people call it. And so this is the takeaway of this video, which is that this is potentially the permanent transformation of Russia into an economy built for endurance rather than prosperity. Because, like that analogy of the death zone, no climate can remain in it forever. Eventually, they must descend. We talk about power cycles and the idea of great powers or empires coming to an end. And in the case of Russia, well, it remains here. It's not going anywhere necessarily as a big power, but it is certainly suffering for long the consequences of the ill-fated decisions of one man. It has entered the death zone, and that is not a temporary situation, especially when the Russian people themselves notice that is a perpetual, possibly terminal decline. It is the structural reality of Russia's economy at the start of 2026. Many people question what would be the end, or what will bring an end to this war. And as someone who's followed this from the beginning, it has never been likely what would happen on the battlefield, but what would happen behind it. Not perhaps because of the remarkable strikes by Ukraine, but because of the inhibitions and obsessions of one man's imperialist goals for his country, which he has attempted to do to glorify it. But in reality, and in an end result, is destroying it. It could well be the biggest mistake of any modern time leader we know of. But that's it from me, everyone. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this, coming to you from London this time around. We look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks all very much for watching. You can find links in the description below to support me if you want further. And do be sure to subscribe to my Substack, where I'm producing more and more written pieces than ever. See you then. Take care.